What's going on, everybody? Welcome back. Face Off Sports Network. I'm Anthony Servino with my top six week 4 starts and sits at the quarterback position. Let's get right into it. We're going to start Andy Dalton, and Andy Dalton, the reclamation project of the Carolina Panthers, got off to an outstanding start, obviously, last week. Andy Dalton looking like the Andy Dalton from earlier in his career with the Cincinnati Bengals and A.J. Green. He absolutely went off for 27.8 quarterback points, 319 yards, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions, 70.3% completion percentage. When it comes to his average receiver yards after the catch, 7.4, which is 97th percentile amongst qualifying quarterbacks. Andy Dalton was simply outstanding. And that was against the Raiders. And now he gets the Bengals. And the Bengals, their defense is erratic. Their defense on paper may look a little bit better than they actually are because on paper, well, they're middle of the pack. But in reality, they are extremely leaky. Ever since Anaromo and company led the Bengals to a Super Bowl a few years ago, the defense, their personnel have been going in the wrong direction. So I don't exactly trust this Bengals defense. I think this is a nice game for Andy Dalton to build off of his performance last week. I think this is obviously, we know this is a revenge game for Andy Dalton where he played the majority of his career. So Cincy, they managed to contain Jacoby Brissett. They managed to contain Patrick Mahomes, but Jaden Daniels lit him up last week. Obviously, Andy Dalton is more of a similar quarterback in terms of his playing style to a Brissett, to Mahomes. In fact, Andy Dalton more of a statue-esque pocket passer. So if he gets the protection, I think he's going to flourish and he's going to be able to pick this secondary apart. And mind you, the Carolina Panthers offensive line, they addressed it this offseason. Bryce Young didn't struggle because of the offensive line. Bryce Young struggled because of Bryce Young. No Adam Thielen, which is fine. Deontay Johnson is more than good enough to get separation on whichever corner is going to be covering him. They're going to open up the running game with guys like Chuba Hubbard and Miles Sanders. They have a couple of nice young wideouts and Xavier Legette. Jonathan Mingo. So there's enough firepower here where we can insert Andy Dalton into our starting lineup with confidence, but tempered expectations. Now we're going to go to Caleb Williams. And I was in on Caleb Williams last week, and Caleb Williams finally delivered for his fantasy managers. Now, he didn't look perfect, made some mistakes in that game, threw 2 interceptions. He lost a fumble. But when it comes to fantasy numbers, career best by far, 363 yards passing. In fact, he's ascending. Week 1, 93. Week 2, 174. 2 really tough defenses. And then last week, absolutely pops for the aforementioned 363, 2 touchdowns. He threw 52 passes because they can't run the ball in Chicago. Not really much on the ground, only 1 rushing attempt for 8 yards. We're not really expecting a dual threat out of Caleb Williams. We're buying into Caleb. We're investing into Caleb for his arm, for his improvisation, and for the weapons he has around him because he has really nice weapons. And what could help is the reports. Roschon Johnson's going to get an extended run. A little bit of a bigger back, a little bit more of a bruiser, and he should be more effective behind this offensive line in theory than DeAndre Swift, who absolutely have struggled so far. Looks like one of the worst free agent pickups in the NFL from this year so far. But if there is a semblance of a running game, certainly things will open up for Caleb Williams, and he gets I'm going to call it a dream matchup against the Rams. The Rams are one of the worst bottom 5 defenses in defending enemy quarterbacks. Now, Jared Goff, they contained him in week 1. Shocker. But the past 2 games, Kyler over 30 points. Brock Purdy, 29.7. 3 touchdown passes conceded in each of the past 2 games. Brock Purdy, it wasn't just Kyler 5 for 59 on the ground. Brock Purdy also took off 10 times for 41. And Caleb, like I said, we're not buying him for his legs, but he has that ability and he can certainly take off this week. And if you're a sports bettor, take the over on Caleb Williams' rushing line. I'm willing to go there. That's how in I am on Caleb Williams to build off of his performance last week and possibly win a game while scoring a lot of fantasy points. Let's go to my final start before we pivot to my sits. And my final start is going to be Brock Purdy. And Brock Purdy is coming off of a nice fantasy outing. Back-to-back games, at least 21.2. Last week, pops for 30.7. I know I said 29.7, depending on your scoring format and if you deduct for turnovers or not, because Brock Purdy last week did lose a fumble. But Purdy, back-to-back games as well, at least 292 yards passing. He did throw for 3 touchdowns last week. He has thrown at least he's completed at least 65.5% of his passes in 3 straight games. Back-to-back games, 77.8, 73.3, and he's doing so without CMC. He's doing so last week without Debo, without Kittle. Jawan Jennings looked like had a legendary game. Brandon Ayuk, we're waiting for him to get going. And now you get New England, and this is a middle-of-the-pack matchup against the Patriots. Christian Gonzalez has been playing outstanding football, but you could certainly get over on this defense, notably on this secondary. The Patriots in week 1, they absolutely shut down Joe Burrow, but they've been generous, right? They're not getting gashed, but they've been generous to the quarterback position. 21.2 to Geno Smith, Aaron Rodgers, 23.9. At least, past 2 games, 327 to Geno, 2 touchdowns and 281 to Aaron Rodgers. So there's production to be had here. And Brock Purdy, even if he's down some weapons once again, we know Kyle Shanahan is going to put Brock Purdy in position to succeed. And by the way, this is a must-have game for the San Francisco 49ers after losing last week to the Rams. So let's look for the best version of Brock Purdy. Let's go to my sits. And we're going to start with Anthony Richardson. And I was all in on Anthony Richardson. I don't know what's going on with Anthony Richardson, but it's not going well right now. Popped in week 1. Looked great. 30.2 fantasy points in the season opener. This is why we drafted Anthony Richardson, but it's been all downhill. Anthony Richardson in the past 2 games, he's descending 17.9, a dreadful 10.8 last week. And granted, that 10.8 came against one of the better secondaries, one of the better defenses that contained the quarterback of the Chicago Bears, but we did not draft Anthony Richardson as high as we did for 10.8 quarterback fantasy points. And it doesn't get much better because now you get Pittsburgh, who's even better. They've conceded the second fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. Anthony Richardson, when it comes to turnovers, 6 interceptions this year, including 5 in his past 2 games. Something needs to happen, and something needs to happen fast. I am not trusting Anthony Richardson. Yes, he has the skill set to pop against anyone. But until I see it get on track, I cannot use him in my fantasy lineups. Pittsburgh, like I said, they've been extremely stingy. You can't get a damn thing going. They played Cousins, 9.8. Knicks, 12.8. Herbert, 10.3. We are sitting Anthony Richardson until further notice, or at least until the Steelers matchup is over. Let's go to my next sit, Matthew Stafford. And Matthew Stafford last week wins a game against San Francisco 49ers. They probably had no business winning. That was the Kyren Williams game. And Stafford only 15.1 PPR points. In fact, in 3 straight games to start the year, Stafford has yet to exceed 19.9. He has yet to hit 20 fantasy points. 19.9 in week 1, all downhill since then. 10.8, 15.1. Well, why? No Puka, no Cooper Kupp. The offensive line's banged up. Last week, his best receiver was Tutu Atwell. The receiving crew right now is Atwell, Whittington, Demarcus Robinson, Tyler Johnson, Colby Parkinson. Got to remember, this was a Rams team. If we scale back to last year, Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, Tyler Higbee, Demarcus was the 3, Tutu the 4, Kyron. A lot has changed, and Matthew Stafford's doing the best or making the best of what he has to work with, and that's not much. And it could work from a fantasy, from a NFL perspective. You get the Bears. This is a winnable football game, but in fantasy, we are fading Matthew Stafford because you could still win a football game and not have a good fantasy outing. We should know this already, but I'm going to beat that into everybody. There's a vast difference between NFL and fantasy. You can be a great NFL quarterback. Doesn't mean you're going to be great in fantasy football. So we're sitting Matthew Stafford. Tough matchup, no weapons. Let's go to my final sit. And this is a start sit. Like, I don't know what to call this, but what we are going to call it is start with caution. So it's not a full sit. It's not a full start, but it's start with caution, Jalen Hurts. So what is a start with caution? Well, Jalen Hurts is a hard guy to bench. It's a hard guy to sit here and say, okay, we're sitting Jalen Hurts because we know who Jalen Hurts is. We know what he brings to the table. But there's a lot of adversity against Jalen Hurts. We don't know what's going on with Lane Johnson. A.J. Brown, we don't know if he's going to return. Probably not. Devonta Smith dealing with the head injury suffered in the second half. We could be looking at a Jalen Hurts-led offense, and his leading receiver might be, once again, Dallas Goedert, Paris Campbell, and Jahan Dotson, and obviously you have Saquon Barkley, but normally we're starting Jalen Hurts comfortably with AJ and with Devonta and with Saquon, and then you have all those ancillary guys I named. Now those ancillary weapons are going to be featured, especially if Devonta Smith cannot suit up. So there's a lot to dissect here. Now, Jalen Hurts, he gets a matchup with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And on paper, it looks like a positive matchup because Tampa Bay, they concede a lot of fantasy points to the quarterback position. They were gashed by Jalen Daniels in week 1, 30 points in his NFL debut. They were good against Jared Goff, just under 14. And then Bo Nix last week, out of nowhere, 21.5. Bo Nix, 216 yards, throwing, no turnovers, 9 rushing attempts, 47 yards, and a touchdown. Very solid outing from Bo Nix. So what do we do with Jalen Hurts here? Because he could be down a few of his best weapons, and we see how that impacts Matthew Stafford, I would temper expectations. Because normally this is a matchup where you plug and play Jalen Hurts, and he could potentially get you 35 fantasy points. His floor might be 25, but that's not the case. So we're going to start Jalen Hurts because there's a very good chance you don't have a better option to put in your starting lineup than Jalen Hurts. But we are going to start him with caution. We're going to start Jalen Hurts with tempered expectations. And guess what? If Jalen Hurts comes out and he's down AJ and he's down Devonta Smith and he still pops, great. But if he doesn't, I'm just telling you now, don't be surprised because this Tampa Bay defense, it's erratic, but it still has some players, and Jalen Hurts does need help. A lot of quarterbacks need help, but Jalen Hurts is obviously at his best with his best weapons. If he's down 1 or 2 of his best weapons, then they're going to be extremely Saquon Barkley dependent, and Jalen Hurts is going to have to do a lot with his legs. And that could be good for fantasy, but if they have to heavily lean on Saquon, then that's going to obviously take away from the overall ceiling of Jalen Hurts. I'm Anthony Servino. Remember, if you like this video, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, the alert icon, so you can be notified anytime we are live to answer your questions like tonight, or drop content just like this. If you have any start sit questions, drop them in a comment. If you want to battle me, you want to come at me, you don't like my takes, let me know. I don't care. I'll talk to you. It's my favorite thing to do. My favorite part about this job. But until next time, I'm Anthony Servino for the Face Off Sports Network. See you later.